had never expected Vera to nearly die because of it. The two men have been found, my lord.
Hey, Fire, how you doing, bro? Let me get this shared out and we'll do a dab. See the size of that chicken? That's a good movie. Okay, what's going on with this? Thought I played it. The hell? Give me 1 second. Not sure what happened there.
But he had almost begun to think it would not happen. And he had never expected Vera to nearly die because of it. The two men have been found, my lord, Dumont
There
said.
we go.
At least, they apparently meet the description the Lady Dira gave. Bashir's head jerked around, murder on his face. The younger man quickly added, "They were dead, my lord, just outside the camp. Each got one thrust with a narrow
Right
blade.
there in the spirit
He
world.
stabbed a finger at the base of his skull, just behind the ear. It had to be more than one did it, unless he was faster than a rock climber." Bashir nodded. The price of failure often was death. 2 to search, and how many to silence them? How many remained? And how long before they tried again? Worst of all, who was behind it? The White Tower? Before Satan? It seemed a decision had been reached for him. No one except Tumad was close enough to hear him, but he spoke softly anyway, and chose his words cautiously. Sometimes the price of carelessness was death, too. "You know where to find the man who came to me yesterday. Find him and tell him I agree. But there will be a few more than we talked about."
The light, feathery snow falling on the city of Cairn dimmed the morning sunlight only a little, just muting the brightness. From the tall, narrow window in the Sun Palace, fitted with a casement of good glass panes against the cold, Samitsu could see clearly the wooden scaffolding erected around the ruined section of the palace, broken cubes of dark stone still littered with rubble, and stepped towers that stopped abruptly short of equaling the rest of the palace's towers. One, the Tower of the Risen Sun, was simply no longer there. Several of the city's fabled topless towers loomed through the drifting white flakes, enormous square spires with huge buttresses, much taller by far than any in the palace, despite its location on the highest hill in a city of hills. They were wrapped in their own scaffolds, and still not completely rebuilt 20 years after the Aiel had burned them. Another 20 might see them done. There were no workmen clambering along the planks on any of the scaffolding, of course, not in this weather. She found herself wishing the snow could give her a respite, too. When Catswain departed a week past, leaving her in charge, her task had appeared straightforward. Make sure the Kyrianan pot did not begin to boil again. That had appeared a simple task at the time, though she had seldom dabbled in politics to speak of. Only one noble retained sizable forces under arms, and Dobrain was cooperative for the most part, seeming to want everything kept quiet. Of course, he had accepted that fool appointment as Steward of Kyrian for the Dragon Reborn. The boy had named a steward of Tyr, too, a man who had been in rebellion against him a month gone. If he had done as much in Ilion, it seemed
Dude,
all
I
too
got a little
probable.
bit of
Those appointments
little bit of
would
wax
cause
in
no
the
end
dispo.
of trouble for sisters to sort out before all
It's
was
called
said and
what?
done. The boy
Animal
brought
mints.
nothing but trouble.
It was
Yet so far,
$7
Dobrain seemed to
for
be
a
using
half a
his
gram.
new post only to run the city, and to quietly rally support for Elaine Trakan's claim to the Sun Throne, if she ever made one. Samitsu was satisfied to leave it
Dude,
at
to
that,
have them were
not
rolling
caring
up.
one way or another who took the Sun Throne. She did not care much for Kyrian at all. The falling snow beyond her window swirled in a gust of wind like a white kaleidoscope. So tranquil. Had she ever valued tranquility before? She certainly could not recall it if she had. Neither the possibility of Elaine Trakan's taking the throne nor Dobrain's new title had brought nearly as much consternation as the ridiculous and ridiculously persistent rumors about the Althor boy going to Tar Valon to submit to Elida, though she had done nothing to quell those. That tale had everyone from nobles to stablemen half afraid to breathe, which was very well and good for maintaining the peace. The game of houses had ground to a halt. Well, compared to how matters normally were in Kyrian. The Aiel who came into the city from their huge camp a few miles east very likely helped, however much they were hated by the general run of folk. Everyone knew they followed the Dragon Reborn, and no one wanted to risk finding themselves on the wrong end of thousands of Aiel's spears. Young Althor was much more useful absent than present. Rumors out of the west of Aiel raiding elsewhere, looting, burning, killing indiscriminately, so merchants' hearsay claimed, gave people another reason to step gingerly with those here. In fact, there seemed to be no burrs to prick Kyrian out of its quiet, aside from the occasional street brawl between four-gators and city folk, who considered the noisy, brightly clad four-gators as awesome as the Aiel, and a good deal safer to fight. The city was crowded to the attics, with people sleeping anywhere they could find shelter from the cold. Yet food supplies were more than adequate, if not overabundant, and trade was actually better than expected in winter. All in all, she should have felt content that she was carrying out Cadswain's instructions as well as the Green could wish for, except that Cadswain would expect more. She always did. Are you listening to me, Samitsu? Sighing, Samitsu turned from the peaceful view through the window, taking pains not to smooth her yellow-slashed skirts. The Jacanda-made silver bells in her hair tinkled faintly, but today the sound failed to soothe her. At the best of times, she did not feel entirely comfortable in her apartments in the palace, though a blazing fire in the wide marble fireplace gave a good warmth, and the bed in the next room had the best quality feather mattresses and goose-down pillows. All three of her rooms were overly ornate, in the severe Kyrianan fashion, the white ceiling plaster worked in interlocking squares, the wide bar cornices heavily gilded, and the wooden wall panels polished to a soft glow, yet dark even so. The furnishings were darker still, and massively constructed, edged with thin lines of gold leaf and inlaid with patterned ivory wedges. The flowered Tyran carpet in this room seemed garishly disordered compared to everything else, and emphasized the surrounding stiffness. It all seemed too much like a cage of late. What really discomfited her, though, was the woman with her hair in ringlets to her shoulders, standing in the middle of the carpet, fists on her hips, a belligerent set to her chin, and a frown narrowing her blue eyes. Sashal wore the great serpent ring, of course, on her right hand, but also an Aiel necklace and bracelet, fat beads of silver and ivory intricately worked and carved, gaudy against her high-necked dress of brown wool, which was plain, if fine and well cut. Not crude pieces, certainly, but flamboyant, and hardly the sort a sister would wear. The oddity of that jewelry might hold the key to much, if Samitsu could ever find the reason behind it. The wise ones, especially Soralia, looked at her as if she were a fool for not knowing without asking, and refused to be bothered with answering. They did that all too often. Most especially Soralia. Samitsu was unused to being thought a fool, and she disliked it immensely. Not for the first time, she found it difficult to meet the other sister's gaze. Sachal was the major reason contentment eluded her, no matter how well everything was going otherwise. Most maddening, Sachal was a red, yet despite her aja, she was oath-sworn to young Althor. How could any Aes Sedai swear fealty to anyone or anything other than the White Tower itself? How in the light could a red swear to a man who could channel? Maybe Varen had been right about Tavir and twisting channels. Samitsu could not begin to think for 31 sisters, 5 of them red, to take such an oath. The Lady Owls has been approached by lords and ladies who represent most of House Riatan's strength, she replied, much more patiently than she felt. They want her to take the high seat of Riatan, and she wants White Tower approval. Aes Sedai approval, at least. For something to do besides match stares and likely rooms, she moved to a blackwood table where a gold-worked silver pitcher sitting on a silver tray still gave off the faint scent of spices. Filling a cup with mulled wine provided an excuse to break the fleeting eye contact. Needing an excuse made her replace the pitcher on the tray with a sharp clink. She found herself avoiding looking at Sachal too often. Even now she realized she was looking at the other woman sideways. To her frustration, she could not quite make herself turn completely to meet her stare. Tell her no, Sachal. Her brother was still alive when last seen, and rebellion against the Dragon Reborn is nothing that need concern. Certainly not now. The memory arose of Toran Riatan as last seen, running off into a strange fog that could take on solid form and kill. A fog that resisted the one power. The shadow had walked outside the walls of Kyrian that day. Samitsu's voice tightened from the effort to stop it short of trembling, not with fear, but anger. That had been the day she failed at healing young Althor. She hated failures, hated remembering them, and she should not have to explain herself. Most of Riatan's strength is not all. Those still tied to Toram will oppose her, with force of arms if necessary, and in any case fostering upheaval inside the houses themselves is no way to maintain the peace. There is a precarious balance in Kyrian now, Sachal, but it is a balance, and we mustn't disturb it. She managed to stop short of saying Cadsuane would be displeased if they did. That would hardly carry weight with Sachal. Upheaval will come whether or not we foster it, the other sister said firmly. Her frown had faded as soon as Samitsu showed she had been listening, though the set of her jaw remained. Perhaps it was stubbornness rather than belligerence, yet that hardly mattered. The other woman was not arguing or trying to convince her, just stating her own position, and most galling of all, plainly doing that much as a courtesy. The Dragon Reborn is the herald of upheaval and change, Samitsu. The herald foretold. And if he weren't, this is Kyrian. Do you think they have really stopped playing at Desdemar? The surface of the water may be still, but the fish never stop swimming. A red, preaching the Dragon Reborn like a street-corner demagogue. Right. And if you are wrong? In spite of herself, Samitsu bit off the words. Sachal, burn her, maintained a perfect serenity. Ailil has forsworn any claim to the Sun Throne in favor of Elaine Tracal, which is what the Dragon Reborn desires, and she is ready to swear fealty to him if I ask it. Toran led an army against Rand Althor. I say the change is worth making and the chance worth taking, and I will tell her so. The bells in Samitsu's hair chimed at an irritated shake of her head, and she barely managed to stop herself from sighing again. 18 of those dragon-sworn sisters remained in Cairo. Cadsuane had carried some away with her, then sent Alana back to take off still more, and others of the 18 besides Sashal stood higher than she, but the Aiel wise ones kept them out of her way. In principle, she disapproved of how that was done. Aes Sedai could not be apprentices, not to anyone. It was outrageous, but in practice it did make her job easier. They could not meddle or try to take charge with wise ones running their lives and watching over their every hour. Unfortunately, for some reason she could not learn, the wise ones looked differently on Sashal and the other two sisters who had been stilled. Still, she felt a faint shiver at the thought, but only faint, and it would be less if she ever managed to work out how Dahmer Flynn had healed what could not be healed. Someone could heal Flynn, even if it was a man. A man channeling light. How the horror of yesterday became merely the uneasiness of today once you grew accustomed. She was sure that Cadsuane would have arranged matters with the wise ones before leaving, had she known about the difference with Sashala and Ergine and Renila. At least, she thought she was sure. This was not the first time she had been pulled into one of the legendary Green's designs. Cadsuane could be more
I'll do another dab as soon as I get a couple rolled up.
Inside plots wrapped in stratagems and all hidden from others. Some were planned to fail in order to help others succeed, but only Cadsuane knew which. Not at all a comforting thought. In any case, those three sisters were free to come and go as they desired, do as they desired, and they certainly felt no need to follow the guidance Cadsuane had left behind, or to follow the sister she had named to lead. Only their mad oaths to Althor guided or constrained them. Samitsu had never felt weak or ineffectual in her life, except when her talent failed her, yet she very much wished that Cadsuane would return and take matters out of her hands. A few words delivered in Iriel's ear would quench any desire the lady had to mount the high seat, of course, yet it would come to nothing unless she found some way to deflect Sashal from her purpose. No matter that Iriel feared having her silly secrets aired abroad. Inconsistency in what Guy told her could well make her decide it was better to try vanishing to her country estates rather than risk offending a sister, whatever she did. Cadsuane would be upset over losing Iriel. Samitsu herself would be upset. Iriel was a conduit into half the plots brewing among the nobles, a gauge to be sure those intrigues were all still petty and unlikely to bring any major disturbance. The cursed Red knew that. And once Sashal gave Iriel this permission, it would be her the woman came running to with her news, not Samitsu Tamagawa. While Samitsu was floundering in her quandary, the door to the hallway opened to admit a pale, stern-faced Kyrianan woman, a hand shorter than either Aes Sedai. Her hair was in a thick gray roll on the nape of her neck, and she wore an unadorned gray dress so dark it was nearly black, the current livery of a Sun Palace servant. Servants never announced themselves or asked admittance, of course, but Corgaida Maran Devon was hardly just another servant. The heavy, silvery ring of long keys at her waist was a badge of office. Whoever ruled Kyrian, the holder of the keys ruled the Sun Palace in simple fact, and there was nothing submissive in Corgaida's manner. She made a minimal curtsy carefully aimed halfway between Samitsu and Sashal. I was asked to report anything unusual, she said to the heir, though it had been Samitsu who asked. Very likely she had known of the power struggle between them as soon as they did themselves. Little in the palace escaped her. I'm told there is an Ogier in kitchens. He and a young man supposedly are looking after work as masons, but I had never heard of Ogier and human masons working together. And Stedding Sofu sent word no masons would be available from any setting for the foreseeable future when we inquired after the incident. The pause was barely perceptible, and her grave expression did not alter. But half the gossip about the attack on the Sun Palace laid it to Althor's doing, the other half to Aes Sedai. A few tales mentioned the Forsaken, but only to pair them with either Althor or the Aes Sedai. Pursing her lips in thought, Samitsu set aside the cursed tangle Karienen made of everything they touched. Denials of Aes Sedai involvement did little good. The three oaths went only so far in a city where a simple yes or no could give rise to 6 contradictory rules. But Ogier.
Hell yeah.
The palace kitchens scarcely took in stray passers-by, yet the cooks very likely would give an Ogier a hot meal just for the strangeness of seeing him. Ogier were even more uncommon than usual this last year or so. A few were still seen now and then, but walking as fast as only an Ogier could, and seldom stopping in one place more than long enough to sleep. They
This
rarely
is
traveled with humans, much less worked with them. The
platinum
pairing tickled something in
garlic
her mind, though.
X
Hoping to tease whatever it
PKM.
was into the open, she opened her mouth to ask a few questions. "Thank you, Court Guider," Sachal said with a smile. "You've been most helpful. But if you will leave us now." Being enthralled with the holder of the keys was a good way to find yourself with dirty bed linens and poorly spiced meals, unemptied chamber pots, and messages that went astray. 1,000 annoyances that could make life a misery and leave you wading in mud trying to accomplish anything at all. Yet somehow that smile appeared to take the sting out of her words for Kogaida. The gray-haired woman bowed her head slightly in assent, and again made the smallest possible curtsy, this time obviously to Sachal. No sooner had the door closed behind the gray-haired woman than Sanitsu thumped her silver cup back on the tray hard enough to
Right,
splash
we have some
warm
long
wine
names in
over
this
her
book
wrist
sometimes,
and rounded on the red sister.
or in this
She was on the
series,
brink of
should I
losing
say.
control of Aileal, and now the Sun Palace itself appeared to be slipping through her fingers. It was as likely Korgada would sprout wings and fly as keep silent about what she had seen here, and whatever she said would flash through the palace and infect every servant, down to the men who mucked out the stables. That final curtsy had made it quite clear what she thought. Right, but Samitsu hated Kairi. The customs of civility between sisters were deeply ingrained, but Sachal did not stand high enough to make her hold her tongue in the face of this disaster, and she intended to deliver the rough side of it. Frowning at the other woman, though, she saw Sachal's face, really saw it, perhaps for the first time, and suddenly she knew why it troubled her so, perhaps even why she had found it difficult to look directly at the Red Sister. It was no longer an Aes Sedai face, outside of time and standing apart from age. Most people were unsure of the look until it was pointed out, but
That
it
one
was
came out kind of
unmistakable to
small.
another sister. Perhaps some bits remained,
It's
scraps
okay.
that made Sachal appear closer to beautiful than she really was. Yet anyone at all would put an age to her, somewhere short of her middle years. The realization froze Samitsu's
Kind of wrote a
tongue.
pinner.
What was known about women who had been stilled was little better than rumor. They ran away and hid from other sisters. Eventually they died. Usually they died soon rather than late. The loss of Saidar was more than most women could bear for very long. But it was all really tittle-tattle. As far as she knew, no one in a very long time had had the nerve to try learning more. The rarely acknowledged fear in the darkest corner of every sister's head that the same fate might come to her one day in a careless moment kept anyone from wanting to know too much. Even Aes Sedai could hide their eyes when they did not want to see. There were always those rumors, though, almost never mentioned, and so vague you could never recall where you heard them first. Whispers on the edge of hearing, yet forever floating about. One that Samitsu had only half remembered, till now, said that a woman who was still grew young again, if she learned. It had always seemed ludicrous, till now. Regaining the ability to channel had not given Sachal back everything. Once more she would have to work with the power for years to gain the face that would proclaim her Aes Sedai to any sister who could see her clearly. Or would she regain it? It seemed inevitable, yet this was unmapped terrain. And if her face was changed, was anything else about her changed as well? Samitsu shivered, harder than she had for the thought of skilling. Perhaps it was as well she had gone slow in trying to puzzle out Dahmer's way of healing. Fingers Fingering her Aiel necklace, Sashal seemed unaware that Samitsu had any grievance, unaware of Samitsu's scrutiny. "This may be nothing, or it may warrant looking into," she said. "But Korgaida was only reporting what she heard. If we want to learn anything, we must go and see for ourselves." Without another word, she gathered her skirts and started out of the apartments, leaving Samitsu only a choice between following or remaining behind. It was intolerable, yet remaining was unthinkable. Sashal was no taller than she, not to speak of, but she had to hurry to keep up as the red glided swiftly along wide, square-vaulted corridors. Taking the lead was out of the question unless she chose to run. She fumed in silence, although it required gritting her teeth. Arguing with another sister in public was improper at best. Worse, without any doubt, it would be futile, and that would only dig the hole she was in deeper. She felt a very great desire to kick something. Stand lamps at regular intervals gave plenty of light, even in the darkest stretches of hallway, but there was little color or decoration beyond the occasional tapestry, with everything in it arranged in orderly fashion, either animals being hunted or nobles fighting gallantly in battle. A few niches in the walls held ornaments of gold or seafolk porcelain, and in some corridors the cornices were worked in friezes, most left unpainted. That was all. Kyrian hid their opulence out of public view, as they did with so much. The serving men and women who hurried industriously along the halls like streams of ants wore livery the color of charcoal, except for those in service to nobles resident in the palace, who seemed bright beside the rest, with their house badges embroidered on their breasts, and their collars and sometimes sleeves marked in house colors. One or two even had a coat or dress all in house colors, and appeared almost an outlander among the others. But they all kept their eyes down and barely paused long enough to offer quick bows or curtsies to the two sisters as they passed. The Sun Palace required countless hundreds of servants, and it seemed they were all scurrying about this morning, tending their chores. Nobles strolled in the hallways too, offering their own cautious courtesies to the Aes Sedai as they passed, perhaps with a greeting carefully balanced between an illusion of equality and the true state of affairs, spoken in low voices that did not carry far. They proved the old saying that strange times make for strange traveling companions. Old enmities had been put away in the face of new dangers, for the moment. Here, 2 or 3 pale Kyrian lords in dark silk coats with thin stripes of color across the front, some with the fronts of their heads shaved and powdered soldier fashion, promenaded alongside an equal number of dark Tyrans, taller in their bright coats with fat striped sleeves. There, a Tyran noblewoman in a snug pearl-sewn cap, colorfully brocaded gown, and pale lace ruff, walked arm in arm beside a shorter Kyrian noble with her hair in an elaborate tower that reached well above her companion's head, smoky gray lace under her chin, and narrow stripes of her house colors cascading down the front of her wide-skirted dark
Yeah,
silk,
give me 1 second.
all like bosom friends and
Yeah, I do
trusted
that.
confidants. Some
Yes.
pairings did look odder than others. A number of
I
women
gotta
had begun
repair it.
wearing outlandish clothes of late, apparently never noticing how they drew men's eyes and made even the servants struggle not to stare. Tight breeches and a coat barely long enough to cover the hips were not suitable garments for a woman, no matter how much effort went into rich embroidery or patterning the coat with gemstones. Jeweled necklaces and bracelets and pins with sprays of colorful feathers only pointed up the oddity, and those brightly dyed boots, with their heels that added as much as a hand to a woman's height, made them appear in danger of falling down with every swaying step. "Scandalous," Sashal muttered, eyeing one such pair of women and twitching her skirts in displeasure. "Scandalous," Samitsu murmured before she could stop herself, then snapped her mouth shut so hard her teeth clicked. She needed to control her tongue. Voicing agreement just because she agreed was a habit she could ill afford with Sashal. Still, she could not help glancing back at the pair in disapproval and a bit of wonder. A year ago, Alina Chuliandred, and Fionda Anaris would have been at each other's throats. Or rather have had their arms men at one another's throats. But then who would have expected to see Bertoma Saiga walking peacefully with Weramon Saniago, neither man reaching for the dagger at his belt? Strange times and strange traveling companions. Doubtless they were playing the game of houses, maneuvering for advantage as they always had, yet dividing lines that once were graven in stone now turned out to have been drawn on water instead. Very strange times. The kitchens were on the lowest level of the Sun Palace above ground, at the back, a cluster of stone-walled, beamed-ceiling rooms centered around a long windowless room full of iron stoves and brick ovens and dressed stone fireplaces, and the heat was enough to make anyone forget the snow outside, or even that it was winter. Normally, sweaty-faced cooks and undercooks, as darkly clad as any other palace servants beneath their white aprons, would have been scurrying about getting ready to prepare the midday meal, kneading loaves on long flour-strewn tables topped with marble, basting the joints and fowl that were turning on spits and fireplaces. Now only the trotting spit dogs were moving, eager to earn their bits from the joints. Baskets of turnips and carrots stood unpeeled and unchopped, and smells sweet and spicy came from untended pots of sauces. Even the scullions, boys and girls surreptitiously wiping their faces on their aprons, stood on the fringe of a group of women clustered around one of the tables. From the doorway, Samitsu could see the back of an Ogier's head rising above them where he was seated at the table, taller than most men would have been standing up, and broad with it. Of course, Kyrianen were short by and large, and that helped. She laid a hand on Sashal's arm, and for a wonder the woman stopped where they were without protest.
Vanished without leaving a clue where he was going,
The Ogier was asking in a deep rumble like the earth shifting. His long, tufted ears, sticking up through dark hair that hung to his high collar, flicked back and forth uneasily. "Oh, do stop talking about him, Master Ladar," a woman's voice answered in a quaver that seemed well practiced. "Wicked he was. Tore half the palace apart with the one power he did. He could turn your blood to ice just looking at you and kill you as soon as look. Thousands have died by his own hand. Tens of thousands. Oh, I never liked talking about him." "For someone who never likes talking about something, Eldred Nevin," another woman said sharply. "You surely talk of little else." Stout and quite tall for a Kyrianen, nearly as tall as Samitsu herself, with a few strands of gray hair escaping her white plain-lace cap, she must have been the chief cook on duty, because everyone Samitsu could see quickly nodded agreement and twittered with laughter and said, "Oh, right you are, Mistress Beldair," in a particularly sycophantic way. Servants had their own hierarchies, as rigidly maintained as the tower itself. "But that sort of thing really is not for us to be gossiping over, Master Ladar," the stout woman went on. "Aes Sedai business, that is, and not for the likes of you and me. Tell us more about the borderlands. Have you really seen Trollocs?" A man muttered. Hidden by the crowd around the table, he had to be looking. Samitsu could see no grown men among the kitchen folk this morning.
Tell me, do you really think they bonded those men you were talking about, those Ashaman, as warders? And what about the one who died? You never said how.
"Why, it was the Dragon Reborn as killed him," Eldred piped up. "That's what Aes Sedai on the man as. Oh, terrible they was, them Ashaman. Turn you to stone with a look they could. You can tell them just by looking at him, you know. Frightful, glowing eyes they have." "Be quiet, Eldred," Mistress Beldair said firmly. "Maybe they was Ashman and maybe not, Master Underhill. Maybe they was bonded and maybe not. All I or anyone else can say is they was with him." The emphasis in her voice made plain who she was talking about. Eldred might consider Randall Thor fearful, but this woman did not want to so much as name him. "And soon after he left, suddenly the Aes Sedai was telling them what to do, and they was doing it. Of course, who knows to do with an Aes Sedai. Anyway, those fellers are all gone off now. Why are you so interested in them, Master Underhill?
Is that an Andorran name? Adar threw back his head and laughed, a booming sound that filled the room. His ears twitched violently.
Oh, we want to know everything about the places we visit, Mr. Spelldare. The borderlands, you say? You might think it's cold here, but we've seen trees crack open like nuts on the fire from the cold in the borderlands. You have blocks of ice in the river floating down from upstream, but we've seen rivers as wide as the Alguenya frozen so merchants can drive loaded trains of wagons across them, and men fishing through holes cut in ice nearly a span thick. At night there are sheets of light in the sky that seem to crackle, bright enough to dim the stars. And
Even Mr. Spelldare was leaning toward the Ogier, caught up. But one of the young scullions, too short to see past the adult, glanced behind him, and his eyes went wide when they lit on Sanitsu and Sashao. His gaze stayed fixed on them as if trapped, but he fumbled with one hand till he could tug at Mr. Spelldare's sleeve. The first time she shook him off without looking around. At a second tug, she turned her head with a scowl that vanished in a blink, when she, too, saw the Aes Sedai. "Grace favor you, Aes Sedai," she said, hastily tucking the stray hair back under her cap as she bobbed her curtsy. "How may I serve you?" Ladar broke off short in mid-sentence, and his ears stiffened for a moment. He did not look toward the doorway. "We wish to speak with your visitors," Sashal said, moving into the kitchen. "We won't disrupt your kitchen for long." "Of course," Aes Sedai. If the stout woman felt any surprise at two sisters wanting to talk to kitchen visitors, she showed none. Head swinging from side to side to take in everyone, she clapped her plump hands and began spouting orders. "Eldred, those turnips will never peel themselves. Who was watching the fig sauce? Dried figs are hard to come by. Where is your basting spoon, Casey? Andil, run, fetch some." Cooks and scullions scattered in every direction, and the clatter of pots and spoons quickly filled the kitchen, though everyone was plainly making an effort to be as quiet as possible so as not to disturb the Aes Sedai. They were plainly making an effort not to even look in their direction, though that involved some contortion. The Ogier rose to his feet smoothly, his head coming near the thick ceiling beams. His clothing was what Sanitsu remembered from meeting Ogier before, a long dark coat that flared over turned-down boots. Stains on his coat said he'd been traveling hard. Ogier were fastidious people. He only half turned to face her and Sashao, even as he made a bow, and he rubbed at his wide nose as if it itched, partially hiding his broad face, but he appeared young for an Ogier.
Forgive us, Aes Sedai, he murmured, but we really must be moving on.
Bending to gather a huge leather script that had a large rolled blanket tied across the top and showed the impressions of several square shapes packed around whatever else was stuffed inside, he hoisted the broad strap over one shoulder. His capacious coat pockets bulged with angular shapes, too.
We have a long way to go before nightfall.
His companion remained seated, though, his hands spread on the tabletop. A pale-haired young man with a week's growth of beard who seemed to have slept more than one night in his rumpled brown coat. He watched the Aes Sedai warily, with dark eyes that belonged on a cornered fox. "Where are you going that you can reach by nightfall?" Sashal did not stop until she was standing in front of the young Ogier, close enough to Meade to crane her neck to look up at him, though she made it seem graceful rather than awkward, as it should have been. "Are you on your way to the meeting we've heard about? In Stedding Shanghai? Master Ladar, is it?" His tall ears twitched violently, then were still, and his teacup-sized eyes narrowed almost as warily as the young man's, till the dangling ends of his eyebrows trailed onto his cheeks.
Ladar, son of Shandin, son of Poema, Aes Sedai, he said reluctantly. But I'm certainly not going to the Great Stump. Why, the elders wouldn't let me close enough to hear what was being said.
He gave a deep bass chuckle that sounded forced.
We can't get where we're going tonight, I suppose. But every league behind us is a league we don't have to walk tomorrow. We need to be on our way.
The unshaven young man stood up, running a hand nervously along the
Hey,
long
Soy, how
hilt
you
of the sword
doing?
belted at his waist. Yet he made no move to pick up the scrip and blanket roll at his feet and follow as the Ogier started toward the door
How
that
you
led
doing?
to the street.
I gotta
Even
go
when the
finish this
Ogier
batch
said
real
over
quick.
his shoulder,
We need
There,
to go
finished
now,
it.
Carl.
Sashal glided fluidly into the Ogier's path, though she had to take 3 strides
How you
to
doing,
gain forward.
Soy?
You were asking after work as a mason, Master Ladar, she said in tones brooking no nonsense. But your hands are not as calloused as any masons I've ever seen. It would be best for you to answer my questions. Suppressing a triumphant smile, Samitsu moved up beside the Red Sister. So, Sashal thought she could simply push her aside and ferret out what was going on, did she? The woman was in for a surprise. You really must stay a while longer, she said to the Ogier in a low voice. The noise in the kitchen should keep anyone from overhearing, yet there was no need to take chances. When I came to the Sun Palace, I had already heard of a young Ogier, a friend of Randall Thor. He left Kyrene some months past, in company with a young man named Carl. Isn't that right, Loyal? The Ogier's ears wilted. The young man bit off a coarse curse he should have known better than to mouth in front
Hell
of
yeah,
sisters.
Soy. Yeah,
I
just
knew
do that
what
little
you wanted.
UFC real
I
quick.
started.
He said harshly, but no. For the most part, he divided his gaze between her and Sashal, yet he was watchful for any of the kitchen workers who might come near. He did not wish to be overheard either. Before I do, I want some answers. What happens to my friends? And him? Did he go mad? Loyal sighed heavily and made a pacifying gesture with one huge hand.
Be easy, Carl, he murmured. Rand wouldn't like you starting trouble with Ice and I. Be easy.
Carlden's scowl only deepened. Abruptly, it occurred to Samitsu that she could have handled this better. Those were not the eyes of a cornered fox, but a wolf. She had grown too accustomed to Dahmer and Jahar and Aben, safely bonded and tamed. That might be an overstatement, though Maurice was making an effort with Jahar. That was Maurice's way. Yet it seemed the horror of yesterday could become the complacency of today after long enough exposure. Carlden Manfor was an Ashaman too, and neither bonded nor tamed. Was he embracing the male half of the power? She almost laughed. Did birds fly? Sashal was watching the young man with a studying frown, her hands much too still on her skirts. But Samitsu was glad not to see the light of Saidar around her. Ashaman could feel it when a woman held the power, and that might make him act precipitately. Certainly she and Samitsu together could handle him. Could they, if he already held the power? Of course they could. Of course. But it would be much better if they did not have to. Sashal certainly was making no move to take charge now, so Samitsu laid a hand lightly on his left arm. Through his coat sleeve it felt like a bar of iron. So he was as uneasy as she. As uneasy as she? Light. But Dahmer and those other two had spoiled all her instincts. He seemed sane as most men when I last saw him, she said softly, with just a slight emphasis. None of the kitchen folk were nearby, but a few had begun sneaking peeks toward the table. Loyal exhaled heavily in relief, a sound like wind rushing across the mouth of a cave, but she kept her attention on Carl. I don't know where he is, but he was alive as of a few days ago. Alana had been close-mouthed as a muscle beyond that, and overbearing, too, with Catswain's note in her fist. Fedwin Moore died of poison, I fear, but I have no idea who gave it to him. To her surprise, Carlden merely shook his head with a rueful grimace. and muttered something incomprehensible about wine. As for the others, they became warders of their own free will. Her Roshan certainly had not wanted to be a warder until she decided she wanted him for one. Even a woman who was not Aes Sedai could usually make a man decide the way she wanted. They thought it a better choice, safer than returning to the others like you. You see, the damage here was done with Saidi. You understand who must have been behind it. It was an attempt to kill the one whose sanity you fear for.
Made it to the second round.
That did not seem to surprise him either. What sort of men were these Ashaman? Was their so-called Black Tower a murder pit? The tightness went out of his arm, though, and suddenly he was just a road-weary young man who needed to shave. What? He breathed.
What do we do now, Loyal? Where do we go? I don't know.
Loyal replied, his shoulders sagging tiredly and his long ears drooping.
We have to find him, Carl. Somehow. We can't give up now. We have to let him know we did what he asked, as much as we could.
And what was it Althor had asked, Zenitsu wondered. With a little luck, she could learn a great deal from these two. A tired man, or Ogier, feeling lost and alone, was ripe for answering questions. Carlden gave a small jump, his hand tightening on his sword hilt, and she bit back a curse of her own as a palace serving woman came running into the room with her skirts gathered almost to her knees. "Lord Dobrain's been murdered!" the serving woman squealed. "We will all be killed in our bed. My own eyes have seen the dead walking old Marangil himself, and my man says spirits will kill you if there has been a murder done. Her mouth froze open when she caught the presence of Aes Sedai, and she skidded to a halt, still clutching her skirts. The kitchen folk seemed frozen too, all watching the Aes Sedai from the corners of their eyes to see what they would do.
Not Dobrain,
Loyal moaned, ears laying flat against his head.
not him.
He looked as much angry as saddened, his face stony. Zenitsu did not think she had ever seen an Ogier angry. "What is your name?" Sashal demanded of the serving woman, before Zenitsu could even part her lips. "How do you know he was murdered? How do you even know he's dead?" The woman swallowed, her eyes held by Sashal's cool gaze. "Sarah, Aes Sedai," she said hesitantly, bending her knees in a curtsy and only then realizing that she still had her skirts gathered up. Hastily smoothing them down only seemed to fluster her more. "Sarah Doinal? They say... Everybody says Lord Dobrain is... She swallowed again, hard. "They all say his wounds are covered with blood. He was found lying in a great pool of it, with his head cut off, they say." "They say a great many things," Sashal said grimly. "And usually they're wrong. Zenitsu, you will come with me. If Lord Dobrain has been injured, you may be able to do something for him. Loyal, Carlden, you come too. I don't want you out of my sight before I have a chance to ask a few questions."
Burn your questions,
the young Ashaman growled, shouldering his belongings. "I'm leaving."
No, Carlden,
Loyal said gently, laying a huge hand on his companion's shoulder.
we can't go before we know about Dobrain. He's a friend, Rand's friend, and mine. We can't. Anyway, where are we hurrying to?
Carlden looked away. He had no answer. Zenitsu squeezed her eyes shut and took a deep breath, but there was no help for it. She found herself following Sashal out of the kitchens, once more hurrying to keep up with quick gliding stride. In fact, she found herself half at a more rapid pace than before. The bubbling of voices rose behind them as soon as they were out the door. The kitchen folk probably all were pressing the serving woman for particulars, details she very likely would invent where her knowledge failed. 10 different versions of events would find their way out of that kitchen, if not as many as there were kitchen folk. Worst of all, 10 different versions of events in the kitchen would find their way out, everyone adding to the rumors Corgida doubtless was already starting. She could hardly recall a day that had gone so badly for her so suddenly, like slipping on one patch of ice only to find another under her feet, then another. Cadswain would have her hide to make gloves after this. At least Loyal and Carlton trailed after Sashal as well. Whatever she learned from them might still be put to advantage, a way to salvage something. Scurrying along at Sashal's side, she studied them in brief glances over her shoulder. Taking short strides to keep from overrunning the Aes Sedai, the Ogier was frowning in worry. Over Dobrin, very likely, but also perhaps over only completing his mysterious task as well as he could. That was a mystery she intended to solve. The young Ashaman had no difficulty keeping up, though he wore an expression of stubborn reluctance and his hand caressed his sword hilt. The danger in him did not lie in steel. He stared suspiciously at the backs of the Aes Sedai head, once meeting Senitsu's glance with a dark glower. He had the sense to keep his mouth shut, though. She would have to find a way to pry it open later for more than snark. Sashal never glanced behind to make sure the pair were following, but then she had to hear the thud of the Ogier's boots on the floor tiles. Her face was thoughtful, and Sanitsu would have given a great deal to know what she was thinking. Sashal might be oath-sworn to Randall Thor, but what protection did that give to an Ashaman? She was red, after all. That had not changed with her face. Light. This could be the worst patch of ice of all. It was a long, arduous climb from the kitchens to Lord Dobrain's apartments in the Tower of the Full Moon, which was usually set aside for visiting nobility of high rank. And all along the way, Sanitsu saw the evidence that Sarah had been far from the first to hear what the ever-anonymous they had to say. Rather than endless streams of servants flowing along the corridors, small, excited knots stood whispering anxiously. At sight of the Aes Sedai, they sprang apart and scurried away. A handful did gape at seeing an Ogier striding through the palace, yet for the most part they all but fled. The nobles who had been about before had all vanished, doubtless back to their own rooms, to mull over what opportunities and hazards Dobrain's death afforded them. Whatever Sashal thought, Samitsu no longer doubted. If Dobrain had been alive, his own servants would have put paid to the rumor already. For further confirmation, the hallway outside Dobrain's rooms was crowded with ashen-faced servants, their sleeves ringed to the elbows in the blue and white of House Taborwin. Some wept, and
That was
others
a hard
looked
match
lost,
there.
their foundation stone pulled out from under them. At a word from Sashal, they stood aside for the Aes Sedai, moving drunkenly or mechanically. Dazed eyes swept by the Ogier without actually registering what they saw. Few remembered to make even half-hearted curtsies. Inside, the anteroom was almost as full of Dobrain's servants, most staring as if poleaxed. Dobrain himself lay motionless on a litter in the middle of the large room, his head still attached to his body, but his eyes closed, and a drying sheet of blood from a long cut in his scalp across his still features. A dark trickle had leaked from his slack mouth. Two serving men with tears streaming down their cheeks paused in the act of laying a white cloth over his face at the entrance of the Aes Sedai. Dobrain did not appear to be breathing, and there were blood-stained gashes in the chest of his coat, with its thin stripes of color that marched down to his knees. Beside the litter, a dark blot larger than a man's body marred the green and yellow Tyran maze of the fringed carpet. Anyone who lost that much blood had to be dead. Two other men lay sprawled on the floor, one with death-glazed eyes gazing at the ceiling, the other on his side, an ivory knife hilt sticking up from his ribs where the blade had surely reached his heart. Short, pale-skinned Kyrianan both wore the livery of palace servants, but a servant never carried the long wooden-handled dagger that lay beside each corpse. A House Taborwin man, his foot drawn back to kick one of the corpses, hesitated on seeing the two sisters, then planted his boot hard in the dead man's ribs anyway. Clearly, proper decorum lay far from anyone's mind at the moment. "Move that cloth out of the way," Sashal told the men by the litter. "Samitsu, see whether you can still help Lord Dobrain." Whatever she believed, instinct had moved Samitsu toward Dobrain, but that command, it was clearly a command, put a stutter in her step. Gritting her teeth, she kept moving and knelt carefully beside the litter, on the side away from the still damp plot, to put her hands on Dobrain's blood-soaked head. She never minded getting blood on her hands, but bloodstains were impossible to get out of silk unless you channeled, and she still felt a pang of guilt at the waist when she used the power for something so mundane. The necessary weeds were second nature to her, so much so that she embraced the source and delved the Kyrian lord without thought, and blinked in surprise. Instinct had made her go ahead, though she had been certain there were 3 corpses in the room, yet life still flickered in Dobrain. A tiny, guttering flame that the shock of healing might well extinguish. The shock of the healing she made. Her eyes searched out the pale-haired Ashaman. He was crouched beside one of the dead servants, calmly searching the man, oblivious of the shocked stares of the living servants. One of the women suddenly noticed Loyal standing just inside the door, and goggled as if he had leapt out of thin air. With his arms folded across his chest and a grim expression on his broad face, the Ogier looked as though he were standing guard. "Carlden, do you know the kind of healing that Dahmer Flynn uses?" Samitsu asked. "The kind that uses all of the 5 powers?" He paused for a moment, frowning at her. "Flynn? I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't have much talent for healing anyway." Eyeing Dobrain, he added, "He looks dead to me, but I hope you can save him. He was at the wells." And he bent back to rummaging through the dead servant's coat. Samitsu licked her lips. The thrill of being filled with Saidar always seemed diminished to her in situations like this. Situations when all of her possible choices were bad. Carefully, she gathered flows of air, spirit, and water, weaving them just so.
Cheers,
The
everyone.
basic weave of healing that every sister knew. No one in living memory had the talent for healing as strongly as she, and most sisters were limited in what they could heal, some to little more than bruises. By herself, she could heal almost as well as a linked circle. Most sisters could not regulate the weave to any degree at all. Most did not even try to learn. She had been able to from the start. Oh, she could not heal one particular thing and leave everything else as it was, the way Dahmer could. What she did would affect everything from the stabbed wounds to the stuffed nose Dobrain was also suffering from. Delving had told her everything that ailed him. But she could wash away the worst injuries as if they had never been, or heal so whoever she healed appeared to have spent days recovering on her own, or anything in between. Each took no less of her strength, but they did require less from the patient. The smaller the amount of change in the body, the smaller the amount of the body's strength it drained. Only, except for the gash in his scalp, Dobrain's wounds were all serious. 4 deep punctures in his lungs, 2 of them gashing the heart as well. The strongest healing would kill him before his wounds finished closing, while the weakest would revive him long enough to drown in his own blood. She had to choose somewhere in the middle and hope that she was right. "I am the best that ever has been," she thought firmly. Cadswain had told her that. "I am the best." Altering the weave slightly, she let it sink into the motionless man. Some of the servants cried out in alarm as Dobrain's body convulsed. He half sat up, deep-set eyes opening wide, long enough for what sounded all too much like a long death rattle to rush out of his mouth. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he slipped from her grasp, thudding back down onto the litter. Hastily, she readjusted the weave and delved him again, holding her breath. He lived. By a hair, and so weak he might yet die, but it would not be those stabs that killed him, except indirectly. Even through the drying blood that matted his hair, shaven away from his forehead, she could see the puckered pink line of a fresh, tender scar across his scalp. He would have the same beneath his coat, and he might be troubled by shortness of breath when he exerted himself, if he pulled through. Yet for the moment he did live, and that was all that mattered. For the moment. There was still the matter of who had wanted him dead, and why. Releasing the power, she stood unsteadily. Saidar draining out of her always made her feel tired. One of the serving men, gaping, hesitantly handed her the cloth he had been going to lay on his lord's face, and she used it to wipe her hands. "Take him to his bed," she said. "Get as much mild honey water down him as you can. He needs to gain strength quickly. And find a wise woman. A reader? Yes, a reader. He will need her, too." He was out of her hands now, and herbs might help. At least they were unlikely to harm, coming from a reader, and at worst the woman would make sure they gave him enough honey water and not too much. With much bowing and many murmurs of thanks, 4 of the serving men took up the litter and carried Dobrain deeper into the apartments. Most of the other servants followed hurriedly, wearing expressions of relief, and the rest dashed out into the corridor. An instant
How's
later,
everyone's
glad
night going
shouts
so
and
far?
cheers broke out, and she heard her name nearly as often as Dobrain's. Very gratifying. It would have been more satisfying if Sashal had not smiled and given her an approving nod. Approving? And why not a pat on the head while she was about it? Carlden had paid no mind at all to the healing, insofar as Samitsu had noticed. Finishing his search of the second corpse, he rose and crossed the room to Loyal, attempting to show the Ogier something, shielded by his body, without letting the Aes Sedai notice. Loyal plucked it, a sheet of cream-colored paper, creased from folding, out of the Ashaman's hand and held it up in front of his face, opened out in his thick fingers, ignoring Carlden's scowl.
But this makes no sense.
The Ogier muttered, frowning as he read.
No sense at all. Unless
He cut off abruptly, long ears flickering, and exchanged a tense look with the pale-haired fellow, who gave a curt nod.
oh, this is very bad,
Loyal said.
If there were more than 2 called, if they found,
He choked off his words again at a frantic headshake from the young man. "I will see that, please," Sashal said, holding out her hand, and please or no please, it was not a request. Carlden attempted to snatch the paper from Loyal's hand, but the Ogier calmly handed it to Sashal, who inspected it without any change of expression, then handed it to Samitsu. It was thick paper, smooth and expensive, and new-looking. Samitsu had to control her eyebrows' desire to climb as she read. "At my command, the bearers of this are to remove certain items which they will know from my apartments and take them out of the Sun Palace. Make them private of my rooms, give them whatever aid they require,
Hell yeah.
and keep silent on this matter in the name of the Dragon Reborn and on pain of his displeasure. Dobrain Taborwin." She had seen Dobrain's writing often enough to recognize the rounded hand as his. "Obviously, someone employs a very good forger," she said, earning a quick, contemptuous glance from Sashal. "It did seem unlikely he wrote it himself and was stabbed by his own men in mistake," the Red said in cutting tones. Her gaze swung to Loyal and the Ashaman. "What is it they might have found?" she demanded. "What is it you are afraid they found?" Carlden stared back at her blandly.
I just meant whatever they were looking for.
Loyal answered.
They
Nice,
had
you're
to
on
be
part 2 now, huh?
something.
But his tufted ears twitched so hard they almost vibrated.
2's a
before he
good
could
one,
master
too.
them. Most Ogier made very
Yeah.
poor liars, at least while young. Sashal's ringlets swung as she shook her head deliberately. "What you know is important. The pair of you are not leaving until I know it, too." And how are you going to stop us? The very quietness of Carlton's words made them more dangerous. He met Sashal's gaze levelly, as if he had not a worry in the world.
What's cool about
Oh, yes.
that
Very
movie
much
is
a wolf, not a fox.
whatchamacallit,
I
me and
thought
my
I'd never
brothers
find
both
you.
lived in that
Both
area
Sarah
where all
and
that
Jono
happened. The whole
announced,
lived in
marching into
Lincoln
that
County
night
for a
in
while.
silence, still wearing
So
her
I'm
red
wearing like
gloves and fur-lined
Pt.2
cloak, with
and
the
all
hood
that area.
thrown back to reveal the carved ivory combs in her
That's
black
what I always
hair.
thought was cool about
There
it.
were damp patches on the shoulders of the
And what's
cloak from
cool, at
melting
least they
snow.
used to,
A tall woman,
when
as
I went
brown
to
as a
school,
sundark Aiel,
as
she had
far as
gone
like
out at
history
first light
went,
to
they
try
taught
finding
the
spices
whole
for some sort of
Lincoln
fish
County
stew for her
War
natives
and
to.
Ability Kid
She
era
spared
for
only the
history
briefest
class.
glance for Loyal and
Because
Carlton,
technically it is
and
part of
did not
history.
waste a moment inquiring after
And
Dunford.
since we're
A party of
in New
sisters has
Mexico,
entered the
that's
city,
some
Sahitsu. I rode like a mad
famous
one to get
outlaws
here
that are
ahead
in
of them, but they
history
could be
from
riding
this
in at this
area.
moment. There are Ashaman with them, and one of the Ashaman is Logain. Carlton barked a rough
Yeah,
laugh,
but we lived in
and
a
suddenly Sahitsu
Capitan, or
wondered whether
how
she
they
was
say
going
it
to
on
live long enough
Young
for
Guns, El
Canzone to have her
Capitan.
hide.
Chapter 1. Time to be gone. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass,
Oh, is that
giving
the
memories that become legend.
excuse me.
Legend fades to myth.
That
Even
was
myth is
cool
long
about
forgotten
living
when
in
the
that
age that
area
gave
is
it birth
that
comes again.
how much
In one age,
history is in that area.
called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the Rannon Hills. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time. But it was a beginning. One among the groves and vineyards that covered much of the rugged hills, the olive trees and evergreen rows, the ordered vines leafless till spring, the cold wind blew west and north across the prosperous farms dotting the land between the hills and the great harbor of Ebudar. The land
Right,
lay
I
winter
like to. I
solid
haven't
still,
gone to see the Grand Canyon,
men
but
and
that'd
women
be
were already
cool.
oiling plowshares and
So I
tending
know,
harnesses,
like every year
preparing
in
for the planting to
at
come.
least in that area,
They
Lincoln,
paid little mind
they
to the trains
have
of heavily laden wagons moving east along the dirt
because
roads,
Lincoln
carrying
County
people who wore
covers
odd clothes
a
and
couple
spoke with odd
different
accents.
I guess little
Many of the
towns.
strangers seemed to be farmers themselves. Familiar implements
But
lashed to their wagon boxes. In
they
their wagons,
have
unfamiliar sack
Ability
boots,
Kid
boots
days,
balled in rough
so they
cloth.
have like
They were heading
reenactments
on
and all
toward more
kinds of cool
distant land,
stuff you can go
nothing
see.
to do with life here and now. The Shonchan hand lay lightly on those who did not contest Shonchan rule, and the farmers of the Rannon Hills had seen no changes in their lives. For them, rain or the lack of it had always been the true ruler. West and north the wind blew, across the broad blue-green expanse of the harbor, where hundreds of huge ships sat rocking at anchor on choppy swells, some bluff-bowed and rigged with ribbed sails, others long and sharp-prowed, with men laboring to match their sails and rigging to those of the wider vessels. Not nearly so many ships still floated there
Well,
as had only a few days
technically,
before, though.
in this
Many
state,
now lay in the shallows,
it's an
charred
open
wrecks,
carry
heeled
state,
over on their
so
sides,
technically, if you
frames
had two
settling in the deep
6-shooters
gray
and you had
mud
the
like
holsters to
blackened
wear them,
skeletons.
as long
Smaller
as you're
craft
legal to
skittered about
carry
the
them with
harbor,
just
slanting under triangular
21
sails
or
or pulling
older
on oars like
with no
many-legged water
felonies,
bugs. Most
you
carrying
could
workers and
pretty much
supplies
wear
to
them out
ships
and
that still
open on your
floated.
hip and
Other
walk
small
around
vessels
town
and
if you
barges
wanted,
rode tethered to what appeared to be tree trunks shorn
which
of
I always thought
branches
was
rising
cool.
out of the blue-green water. And from those, men dove holding stones to carry them down
If I was
swiftly to
able
sunken
to, I
ships
would.
below, where they tied ropes to whatever could be hauled up for salvage. 6 nights
Yeah,
ago,
but this
death
state
had
you
walked
could
across
pretty
the
much walk
water
around
here,
like that
the one power
if
killing
you
men and
wanted.
women and ships, and darkness split by silver lightnings and hurtling balls of fires. Now the rough rolling harbor, filled with furious activity, seemed at peace by comparison. The chop giving up spray to the wind
Not
that
so
blew north and
much,
west
but
across the mouth of the river Eldar,
there's too many
where it
people in
widened
this
into the
town that
harbor,
can't carry
north
them
and west
legally.
and inward. Sitting cross-legged atop a boulder covered with brown moss on the reed-fringed bank of the river, Matt hunched his shoulders against the wind and cursed silently. There was no gold to be found here, no women or dancing, no fun. Plenty of discomfort, though.
But
In
there
short,
is
it was the last sort of place he would choose.
a
normally.
couple robberies that have happened,
The
but
sun
not
stood
too
barely
much
its own height
recently.
above the horizon. The sky overhead was pale slate gray, and thick purple clouds moving in from the sea threatened rain. Winter hardly seemed winter without snow. He had yet to see a single flake in Ebudar. But a cold, damp morning wind off the water could serve as well as snow, chill a man to the bone.
Yeah,
6
for the
nights
most
since
part,
he
a
had
lot
ridden
of
out of the
people
city in
do.
a storm, yet his throbbing hips seemed to
It's
think
good
he
you
was
could
still soaked to the
you
skin
could buy
going
'em.
into a saddle.
You could go to
This was no
Walmart
weather
and
or
get
time
them.
of day for a man to be out by his own choice. He wished he had thought to bring a cloak. He wished he had stayed in
At
bed.
least you could go to Walmart
Ripples in
and
the
buy
land hid Abu
shotguns and
Dar, just over a
rifles
mile to the
for the
south,
most part.
hid him from the city as well. But there was not a tree or anything more than scrub brush in sight. Being in the open this way made him feel as though ants were crawling under his skin. He should be safe, though. His plain brown woolen coat and cap were nothing like the clothes he was known by in the city. Instead of black silk, a drab woolen scarf hid the scar around his neck. The collar of his coat was turned up to hide that as well. Not a bit of lace or a thread of embroidery, dull enough for a farmer milking cows. No one he needed to avoid would know him to recognize, if they saw him, not unless they were close. Just the same, he tugged the cap a bit lower. You intend to stay out here much longer, Mac? Noel's tattered dark blue coat had seen better days, but then so had he. Stooped and white-haired, the broken-nosed old fellow was squatting on his heels below the boulder, fishing off the riverbank with a bamboo pole. Most of his teeth were missing. Sometimes he felt at a gap with his tongue, as though surprised to find the empty space. It's cold, in case you haven't noticed. Everybody always thinks it's warm in Abu Dar, but winter is cold everywhere, even places that make Abu Dar feel like Shinar. My bones crave a fire, or a blanket anyway. A man can be snug with a blanket, if he's out of the wind. Are you going to do anything but stare downriver? When Matt only glanced at him, Noel shrugged and went back to peering at the tarred wooden float bobbing among the sparse reeds. Now and then he worked one gnarled hand as though his crooked fingers felt the chill particularly, but if so, it was his own fault. The old fool had gone wading in the shallows to scoop up minnows for bait at the basket. It now sat half submerged, anchored by a smooth stone at the edge of the water. Despite his complaints about the weather, Noel had come along to the river without urging or invitation. From things he had said, everyone he cared about was long years dead, and the truth of it was he seemed almost desperate for any sort of company. Desperate indeed to choose Matt's company, when it could be 5 days from Abu Dar by now. A man could cover a lot of ground in 5 days if he had reason to, and a good horse.
Nice
Matt had thought of that
fire.
very subject often enough himself.
That's cool.
On the far side of the Eldar, half hidden by one of the marshy islands that dotted the river, a broad-beamed rowboat backed oars. One of the crew stood up and fished in the reeds with a long boat hook. Another oarsman helped him heave what he had caught into the boat. At this distance, it looked like a large sack. Matt winced and shifted his eyes downriver. They were still finding bodies, and he was responsible. The innocent died along with the guilty. And if you did nothing, then only the innocent died. Or as bad died. Maybe worse than, depending on how you looked at it. He scowled irritably.
Hell yeah.
Blood and ashes, he was turning into a bloody philosopher. Taking responsibility drained all the joy out of life and dried a man to dust. What he wanted right then was a great deal of mulled wine in a snug common room full of music, and a plump, pretty serving maid on his knee, somewhere far from Abu Dar. Very far. What he had were obligations he could not walk away from, and a future he did not fancy. There seemed no help at all in being forgiven. Not if this was how the pattern shaped itself to you. He still had his luck, anyway.
Oh, my back's
At
killing
least
me
he was
right now.
alive and not chained in a cell. Under the circumstances, that counted as luck. From his perch, he had a fairly clear view down past the last low, marshy river islands. Wind-caught spray drifted up the harbor like banks of fine mist, but not enough to hide what he needed to see. He was attempting to do sums in his head, counting ships afloat, trying to count wrecks. He kept losing his place, though, thinking he had counted vessels twice and starting over. The sea folk who had been recaptured intruded on his thoughts, too. He had heard that gibbets in the Rahad across the harbor displayed more than 100 corpses, with placards listing murder and rebellion as their crimes.
I'm not
Normally,
sure.
Shan used the headsman's
That
axe,
sounds familiar.
and the estate. Well, the blood got
My
the
brother
strangler,
probably
of course,
has.
but property had to settle for being hanged. Burn me, I did what I could, he thought sourly. There was no use feeling guilty that was all he could do. Not a bit of use. None. He had to concentrate on the people who escaped. The Yatha Mier who got away had taken ships in the harbor for their flight. While they might have seized some smaller craft, anything they could board and overwhelm in the night, They had intended to carry off as many of their people as possible. With thousands of them laboring as prisoners in the Rahad, that would have meant big ships by choice. That meant Shonchan great ships. Many of the sea folks' own vessels were large enough, for certain, but they had all been stripped of their sails and rigging by that time to be fitted out in the Shonchan fashion. If you could calculate how many great ships remained, you might have some notion of how many up on the air had actually reached freedom. Freeing the sea folk windfinders had been the right thing to do, the only thing he could do. But aside from the hangings, hundreds and hundreds of bodies had been fished out of the harbor in the last 5 days, and the light only knew how many had washed out to sea with the tides. The grave diggers labored from sunup to sundown. Graveyards were filled with weeping women and children. Men, too. More than a few of those dead had been Athan Meir, with no one to weep while they were dumped into mass graves. And he wanted some idea of the number he had saved to balance his bleak suspicions of the number he had killed. Estimating how many ships had made it out into the Sea of Storms was difficult, though, quite apart from losing the count. Unlike Aes Sedai, windfinders had no strictures against using the power as a weapon, not when the safety of their people was at stake, and they would have wanted to halt pursuit before it began. No one gave chase in a burning ship. The Shonchan, with their Damani, had even less compunction against fighting back. Lightning bolts blazing through the rain as numerous as blades of grass, balls of fire streaking across the sky, some the size of horses. The harbor seemed to flame from one side to the other, till even in a storm, the night made any illuminator's show look stark. Without turning his head, he could count a dozen places where the charred ribs of a great ship, stuck up out of shallow water, or a huge bluff-bout hull lay on its side, with the harbor waves looking against the tilted deck. And twice as many where the lines of blackened timbers were finer, the remains of sea-folk breakers. Apparently, they had disliked leaving their own vessels to people who had put them in chains. 3 dozen right in front of him, that without adding in the sunken wrecks that had salvage boats working over them. Perhaps the seafarer could tell great ship from wrecker by the tops of masts sticking out of the water, but the task was beyond him. Suddenly, an old memory tugged at him. Lading ships for an attack from the sea. How many men could be crowded into how much space for how long? It was not his memory, really, from the ancient war between Fergensea and Marina, yet it seemed his. Realizing that he had not actually lived one of those ancient bits of other men's lives that were stuck in his head, always took him a little by surprise now. So maybe they were his, in a way. They were certainly sharper than some stretches of his own life. The vessels he recalled had been smaller than most in the harbor, if the principles were the same. They don't have enough ships, he muttered. The Shonchan had even more in Tanchico than had come here. The losses here were sufficient to make the difference. Enough ships for what? Philip said. I never saw so many in one place before. That was quite a statement coming from him. To hear Noel tell it, he had seen everything, and nearly always bigger or grander than what was in front of his nose. Back home, they would have said he kept tight purse strings on the truth. Matt shook his head. They don't have enough ships left to take them all back home. We don't have to go home, a woman drawled behind him. We've come home. He did not quite jump at the slurred Shonchan accent, but it was a near thing before he recognized who was speaking. Egenin was scowling, her eyes like blue daggers, but not for him. At least, he thought not. She was tall and lean, with a hard face that was pale-skinned despite a life at sea. Her green dress was bright enough for a tinker, or close to it, and embroidered with a mass of tiny yellow and white blossoms on the high neck and down the sleeves. A flowered scarf, tied tightly under her chin, held a long black wig on her head, spilling halfway down her back and over her shoulders. She hated the scarf and the dress, which did not quite fit, but her hands checked every other minute to make sure the wig was straight. That concerned her more than her clothes, though concern was not nearly a strong enough word. She had only sighed over cutting her long fingernails short, but she almost had a fit, red-faced and pop-eyed when he told her she must shave her head completely. The way her hair had been cut before, shaved above her ears with only a bowl-like cap and a wide shoulder-length tail on her back remaining, shouted that she was of the Shonchan blood, a lesser noble. Even someone who had never laid eyes on a Shonchan would have remembered seeing her. She had agreed, reluctantly, but afterward she was close to hysterical, until she was able to cover her scalp. Not for the reasons most women would have gone over the moon, though. No. Among the Shonchan, only the imperial family shaved their heads. Men who went bald began wearing wigs as soon as their hair started falling out to any noticeable degree. Aginin would have died before letting anyone think she was pretending to belong to the Imperial family, even people who would never have had the thought in their lives. Well, that sort of pretense did carry a death penalty among the Shanshan, but you would never have believed she was sworn about it so. What was one more death penalty when your neck was already being stretched for the axe? The strangling cord, in her case. The noose would be for him. Slipping the half-drawn knife back up his left sleeve, he slid down from the boulder. He landed poorly and almost fell, barely hiding a wince at the stabbing jar to his hip. He did hide it, though. She was a noblewoman and a ship captain. She made enough tries at taking charge without him showing any more weakness to give her an opening than he had to. She had come to him for help, not the other way round. That buttered no bread with her. Leaning against the boulder with his arms folded, he pretended he was lounging, hardly kicking at tufts of dead grass to work the pain out. That was sharp enough to put sweat on his forehead, despite the cold wind. Fleeing in that storm had cost him ground with his hip, and he had not made it up yet. Are you sure about the sea folk? He asked her. No point in mentioning the lack of ships again. Too many Shanshan settlers had spread out from Ebudar anyway. And apparently even more from Tanchico. However many ships they had, no power on earth would ever root out all the Shanshan now. Reaching toward the wig again, she hesitated, frowning at her short fingernails, and instead tucked her hands under her arms. What about them? She knew he had been behind the Windfinder's break for freedom, but neither of them had mentioned it specifically. She always tried to avoid talking about the Alpha in the air. Quite aside from all the sunken ships and dead, freeing Damani was another death penalty charge, and disgusting besides, in Shanshan view, as bad as rape or molesting children. Of course, she had helped free some Damani herself, though to her way of thinking, that was among the least of her crimes. Still, she avoided that topic too. There were quite a few subjects she held silent on. Are you certain about the Windfinders who were caught? I've heard talk about cutting off hands or feet. That swallowed a sour taste. He had seen men die, had killed men with his own hands. The light sent him mercy he had killed a woman once. Not even the darkest of those other men's memories burned so hot as that. A few of those were dark enough to need drowning in wine when they floated to the surface. The thought of deliberately cutting off someone's hands curdled his stomach. Aginion's head jerked, and for a moment he thought she would ignore his question. Talk from Rena, I'll wager, she said, with a dismissive gesture. Some Sultan talk about that nonsense to frighten recalcitrant Damani when they're new leashed. But nobody's done it in, 600 or 700 years. Not many, anyway. And people who can't control their property without mutilation are Sai-Mosief to start. Her mouth twisted in loathing, but whether for mutilation or Sai-Mosief was unclear. Shamed or not, they do it, he snapped. Sai-Mosief went beyond being shamed to a Shanshan. He doubted that anyone who deliberately cut off a woman's hand would be humiliated enough to kill themselves. Is Suroth one of that not many? The Shanshan woman glared to match his and planted her fists on her hips, leaning forward with her feet astride as though she were on the deck of a ship and about to berate a fumble-witted sailor. The High Lady Suroth doesn't own these Damani, you lump-brained farmer. They're property of the Empress. May she live forever. Suroth might as well slit her own wrists straight away as order something like that for Imperial Damani. That's even if she would. I've never heard of her mistreating her own. I'll try to put this in terms you can understand. If your dog runs away, you don't maim it. You switch the dog so it knows not to do that again, and you put it back in the kennel. Besides, Damani are just too valuable. Matt finished for her dryly. He had heard that until he was sick of it. She disregarded his sarcasm, or maybe did not notice. In his experience, if a woman did not want to hear something, she could ignore it till you yourself started to doubt you had spoken. You're finally beginning to understand, she drawled, nodding. Those Damani you're so worried about probably don't even have welts left by this time. Her gaze went to the ships in the harbor, and slowly took on a look of loss, made deeper by the hardness of her face. Her thumbs ran across her fingertips. You wouldn't believe what my Damani cost me, she said in a quiet voice. Her, and hiring the Sultan for her. Worth every throne I paid, of course. Her name's Sarisa. Well trained. responsive. She'll gorge herself on honeyed nuts if you let her, but she never gets seasick or the sulks, the way some do. Pity I had to leave her in Kenterine. I suppose I'll never see her again. She sighed regretfully. I'm sure she misses you as much as you miss her, Noel said, flashing a gap-toothed smile. And for all the world, he sounded sincere. Maybe he was. He contended that he had seen worse than Damani and Dr. Vale, for what that was worth. Eginen's back stiffened, and she frowned as if she did not believe his sympathy. Or else she had just realized how she was staring at the ships in the harbor. Certainly she turned away from the water very deliberately. I gave orders that no one was to leave the wagons, she said firmly. Likely crewmen on her ships had jumped at that tone. She jerked her head away from the river, as though she expected Matt and Noel to jump where she indicated too. Did you now? Matt grinned, showing teeth. He could manage an insolent grin that sent most puffed-up fools into apoplexy. Eginen was far from a fool, most times, but puffed up she was. Ship captain and noble one. He did not know which was worse. Bah, for both. Well, I was about ready to head that way. Unless you're not done fishing, Noel. We can wait here a while if you're not. But the old man was already emptying the remaining silver-gray minnows out of his basket into the water. His hands had been broken badly, maybe more than once, by their lumpy appearance, yet they were deft in winding his line around the bamboo pole. In the short time he had been fishing, he had caught nearly a dozen fish, the largest strung through the gills on a looped reed, and he moved those to the basket before picking it up. He claimed that at the time he had peppers, he was going to make a fish stew. From Shara, of all places. As well say from the moon. A stew that would make Matt forget all about his hip. The way Noel went on about the peppers, Matt suspected any forgetting would be because he was focused on finding enough ale to cool his tongue. Eginen, waiting impatiently, was paying no attention to Matt's grin either, so he slipped an arm around her. If they were heading back, they might as well get started. She knocked his hand away from her shoulder. The woman made some maiden aunts he had known look like tavern girls. We're supposed to be lovers, you and I, he reminded her. There's nobody here to see, she growled. How many times do I have to tell you? That was the name she was using. She claimed it was Terabon. If we don't hold hands unless we see somebody watching, we're going to look a pretty strange pair of lovers to anybody we don't see. She snorted in derision, yet she let him put his arm back around her, around him. But she gave him a warning stare at the same time. Matt shook his head. She was crazy as a spring hare if she thought he enjoyed this. Most women had a little padding over their muscles, at least the women he liked. But hugging Eginen was like hugging a fence post. Almost as hard and definitely as stiff. He could not puzzle out what Dolman saw in her. Maybe she had not given the Ileana any choice. She had bought the man, after all, same as buying a horse. Burn me, I'll never understand these shots. Not that he wanted to. The only thing was, he had to. As they were turning away, he took one last glance back at the harbor. He almost wished he had not. Two small sailing craft broke through a wide wall of mist that was drifting slowly down the harbor, drifting against the wind. Time to be gone and past time. It was better than 2 miles from the river to the Great North Road, across rolling countryside covered in winter-brown grasses and weeds and dotted with clumps of vine-tangled bushes too thick to push through, even with most of the leaves gone. The rises hardly deserved the name of hill, not for anyone who had climbed in the sand hills and the mountains of mist as a boy. There were gaps in his own memories, but Matt could remember some of that. Yet before long, he was glad he had an arm around somebody. He had sat motionless on that bloody rock for too long. The throb in his hip had faded to a dull ache, but it still made him limp. And without some sort of support, he would have been staggering on the slopes. Not that he leaned on again, of course, but holding on helped steady him. The woman frowned at him, as though she thought he was trying to take advantage. If you did as you were told, she growled, I wouldn't need to carry you. He showed his teeth again, this time not trying to disguise it as a smile. The way Noel scampered along beside them easily, never missing a step despite balancing his basket of fish on his hip with one hand, carrying his fishing pole in the other, was embarrassing. For For all he looked hard-worn, the old man was spry enough, too spry by half at times. Their route slanted north of the Circuit of Heaven, with its long open-ended tiers of polished stone seats where, in warmer weather, wealthy patrons sat on cushions beneath colorful canvas awnings to watch their horses race. Now the awnings and poles were stowed away, the horses all in their country stables, those the Seanchan had not taken, and the seats were empty save for a handful of small boys darting up and down the tiers in a game of keep away. Matt was fond of horses and racing, but his eyes slid past the circuit toward Abu Dar. Whenever he topped a rise, the city's massive white ramparts were visible, deep enough that they supported a road encircling the city on top. And looking gave him an excuse to pause a moment. Fool woman. A scrap of a limp did not mean she was carrying him. He managed to keep a good temper, take the rough with the smooth, and no complaining. Why could she not? Inside the city, white roofs and walls, white domes and spires, ringed in thin bands of color, gleamed in the gray morning light, a picture of serenity. He could not make out the gaps where buildings had burned to the ground. A long line of farmers' high-wheeled ox carts was trundling through the wide arched gateway that opened on the Great North Road, men and women on their way to the city markets with whatever they had left to sell this late in winter. And in their midst, a merchant's train of big canvas-topped wagons behind 6- and 8-horse teams, carrying goods from the light new wear. 7 more trains, ranging from 4 wagons to 10, stood in line at the side of the road to wait for the gate guards to finish their inspections. Trade never stopped entirely while the sun shone, no matter who ruled the city, unless there was actual fighting. Sometimes it did not stop completely then. The stream of people flowing the other way was mostly Seanchan, soldiers in ordered ranks with their segmented armor painted in stripes, helmets that looked like the heads of huge insects, some marching and some mounted. Nobles who were always mounted, wearing ornate cloaks, pleated riding dresses and lace veils, or voluminous trousers and long coats. Seanchan settlers were still part of the city too, wagon upon wagon filled with farmers and craftsmen, and the tools of their trades. The settlers had begun leaving as soon
I
as they
think
came
he
up
still
the
has
ships,
family
but it would be
around,
weeks before they were all gone.
at least
It was a
Garrett
peaceful
does. I
scene.
think he has
Work a day
family
in
around
Portland,
Lincoln
you
and
ignored what lay behind it.
Alamo
Every
Gordo
time he reached
area.
the place where he could see the gates, his mind flashed back
At
to
least I
6
think
nights
he
ago.
still does.
He was there again, at those same gates. The storm had grown worse as they crossed the city from the terracing palace. Rain fell by buckets, pounding the darkened city and slicking the paving stones under the horses' hooves. And wind howled off the sea of storms, driving the rain like stones from slings, jerking at cloaks so that keeping it all dry was a lost cause. Clouds hid the moon, and the deluge seemed to soak up the light of the pole lanterns carried by Blerick and Fenn, on foot ahead of the rest. Then they entered the long passageway through the city wall and gained a bit of shelter, at least from the rain. The wind made the high-ceilinged tunnel keen like a flute. The gate guards were waiting just inside the far end of the passage, 4 of them, also bearing pole lanterns. A dozen more, half of them Seanchan, carried halberds that could strike at a man in the saddle or pull him out of it. 2 Seanchan with their helmets off were peering from the lighted doorway of the guardhouse built into the white plastered wall. Shifting shadows behind them told of others inside. Too many to fight past quietly, maybe too many to fight past at all, not without everything going off like an illuminator's firework bursting in his hand. The guards were not the danger anyway, not the main danger. A tall, plump-faced woman in dark blue, her divided ankle-length skirts, bearing red panels worked with silver lightning bolts, stepped past the men in the guardhouse door. A long silvery metal leash was coiled in the Suldam's left hand, free and connecting her to the glaying woman in a dark gray dress who followed her out with an eager grin.
Oh, did he?
Matt had known they would be there.
That's crazy.
Seanchan had Suldam and Damani at all the gates now. There could even be another pair inside, or 2. They did not mean to let one woman who could channel escape their nets. The silver fox-head medallion beneath his shirt lay cold against his chest. Not the cold that signaled someone embracing the source nearby, just the accumulated chill of the night and his flesh too icy to warm it. But he could not stop waiting for the other. Light, he was juggling fireworks tonight, with the fuses lit. The guards might have been puzzled by a noblewoman leaving Abu Dar in the middle of the night and that weather, with over a dozen servants and strings of pack horses indicating a journey of some distance. But Aginin was of the blood, her cloak embroidered in an eagle with spread black and white wings, and long fingers on her red riding gloves to accommodate her fingernails. Ordinary soldiers did not question what the blood chose to do. even the low blood, which did not mean there were no formalities. Anyone was free to leave the city when they wished, but the Shonchan recorded the movement of the money, and 3 rode in the entourage, heads down and faces covered by the hoods of their great cloaks, each linked to a mounted Suldam by the silvery length of an item. The plump-faced Suldam walked by them with barely a glance, strolling down the tunnel. Her demonic peered intently at every woman they passed, though, sensing whether she could channel. Matt held his breath when she paused beside the last mounted demonic, with a slight frown. Even with his luck, he would not bet against the Shonchan recognizing an Aes Sedai's ageless face
Spawn Ranch.
inside that hood. There were Aes Sedai held as demonic, but what were the odds that all 3 of the Ginans would be? Like, what were the odds one of the low blood would own 3? The plump-faced woman made a clicking sound, as you might to a pet dog, and twitched the item. The demonic followed her on. They were looking for Marath demonic, trying to escape the leash, not demonic. Matt still thought he might choke. The sound of dice rolling had started up again in his head, loud enough to rival the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Something was going to go wrong. He knew it. The officer of the guards, a burly Shonchan with tilted eyes like a Saldanian, with pale honey-brown skin, bowed courteously and invited a Ginan into the guardhouse to have a cup of spiced wine, while a clerk wrote down the information about the demonic. Every guardhouse Matt had ever seen was a stark place, yet the lamplight glowing in the arrow slits made this one seem almost inviting. A pitcher plant probably looked inviting to a fly, too. He had been glad of the rain dripping from the hood of his cloak and running down his face. It disguised the sweat of his nerves. He held one of his throwing knives, resting flat atop the long bundle draped in front of his saddle. With it lying flat like that, none of the soldiers should notice. He could feel the woman inside the cloth breathing under his hands, and his shoulders were knotted from waiting for her to cry out for help. So Lucia kept her mount close to him, peering at him from the shelter of her hood, with her golden braid tucked out of sight, never even glancing away when the Suldam and Damani walked by. A shout from Selucia would have put the weasel in the chicken run as much as one from Tuon. He thought the threat of the knife had held both women silent. They had to believe he was desperate enough, or crazy enough to use it, but he still could not be sure. There was so much about knife he could not be sure of, so much off balance and askew. He remembered holding his breath, wondering when someone would notice that the bundle he carried was richly embroidered, and question why he was letting it get soaked with rain, wondering and cursing himself for grabbing a wall hanging because it had been close to hand. In memory, everything slowed. The Ginan stepped down, tossing the reins to Doman, who took them with a bow from his saddle. Doman's hood was pushed back just enough to show that his head was shaved on one side, and his remaining hair gathered in a braid that hung to his shoulder. Raindrops dripped from the stocky Illianer's short beard, yet he managed the proper stiff-necked arrogance of a Sojin, hereditary upper servant to one of the blood, and thus almost equal to the blood. Definitely higher than any common soldier. Ginan glanced back toward Matt and his burden, her face a frozen mask that could pass for hauteur, if you did not know she was horrified by what they were doing. The tall Suldam and her Damani turned briskly back toward the tunnel, finished with their inspection. Vannon, just behind Matt, leading one of the strings of pack horses, and as always sitting his horse like a sack of soup, leaned from his saddle and spat. Matt did not know why that hung at
I remember, I don't think none of the structures are up anymore. I think it's just
trumpets sounded,
open
in the
fields.
distance far behind them. From south of the city, where men had been planning to fire Shonchan supplies stored along the Bay Road. The officer of the guard hesitated at the sound of the trumpets, but suddenly a bell pealed loudly in the city itself, then another. And then it seemed hundreds were clanging alarm in the night, as the black sky split with more lightning than any storm had ever birthed, silver blue streaks stabbing down inside the walls. They bathed the tunnel in flickering light. That was when the shouting started, amid the explosions back in the city, and the screaming. For a moment, Matt had cursed the windfinders for moving sooner than he had been promised. The dice in his head had stopped, he realized. Why? It made him want to curse all over
Oh,
again.
it's not a parking lot
There was
because
no time for even that.
someone still
Next
owns
instant,
that
the officer was
property.
hurriedly urging Ginan back into his
It's
saddle and
just
on her way, hurriedly shouting orders
they've
to the
let
men
either
boarding
the
out the
structures
guardhouse,
fall
rushing
down
wide to the
or
city at a run to see what the alarm was,
just
while he
tore
arrayed
them
the rest
down.
against any threat from inside or out. The plump-faced
Yeah,
woman ran
it's
to place
just
herself and her Damani with the soldiers,
overgrown field,
along with another
pretty
pair of women
much.
linked by an item, who came running from the guardhouse. And Matt and the others galloped out into the storm, carrying with them 3 Aes Sedai, Two of them escaped the money, and the kidnapped heir to the
I
Shanshan
think there's
crystal
someone
throne,
you can
while behind them a
that
far
does little
worse storm
tours. They'll
broke
take
overhead the
people
dock.
out there and like
Lightning
show
bolts
you
moved
the
in less than
area.
blades of grass. With a shiver, Matt pulled himself back to the present. The demon scowled at him, gave him an exaggerated pull. Lovers arm in arm don't hurry, he muttered. They stroll. She sneered. Don't be
Probably.
blinded by love. That they had taken too many thumps on the head. The worst was over and done, in any case. Matt hoped that getting out of the city had been the worst. He had not felt the dice since. They were always a bad sign. His back trail was as muddled as he could manage, and he was sure it would take someone as lucky as he to separate the gold from the dross. The Seekers had been on a Guinan scent.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.